Well, this is quite an unusual setup. Normally it's via Zoom. Normally I don't get to meet and see the people I'm talking to. And I also have my little script, my crib notes in front of me. This is completely different. I'm going to be making it up as I go along. I'm delighted to meet Sviatoslav, who is the co-founder of OpenMinds. Now, this is a fascinating organisation that I've just become aware of. My first question is going to be to ask more about that and more about its work, its impact, and what its ambitions are. But let's start with you. I won't do my long rambling intro because we're here in person, so I'll get you to explain a bit about yourself and your motivations for starting OpenMinds.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Jonathan. Thank you for the invitation. OpenMinds is a company that is focused on cognitive threats, intelligence, and response. And the term cognitive threats might be unfamiliar to some audience, but also might be quite loaded with many things. And of course, it's worth maybe over the course of our conversation to dive deeper into what does it mean specifically. The story of OpenMinds goes back to, of course, not just the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, which was my sort of response as an individual. How can I, in the best way, serve my country with the prior experience and skills and network I had? Yeah, but it also just, in a way, a point of where all my prior interests and sort of experience created this kind of unique and distinct intersection of different fields of science and applied sort of knowledge, more specifically technology, social and behavioral sciences, and studies of totalitarianism and propaganda in a way. So my bachelor degree was in history, but I also studied quite a lot social psychology, cognitive psychology, and my career began in the domain of digital marketing and ad tech in a way. So I was working a lot with human behavior change in the commercial domain, while also looking a lot at the same time at the history of the whole human perception change. And when the full-scale invasion started, that was kind of a very obvious urge and answer what I shall be doing to serve my country best.
I think that explains partly why we sort of hit it off when we were planning this episode. We had a chat last week. Until recently, I was working in media as well, or as I call it, commercial propaganda. And of course, the podcast is all about fighting propaganda. But history seems to me an absolutely crucial element. You cannot fight propaganda with technology alone. You have to be able to dig inside the narratives, and so many of Russia's propagandistic narratives are derived from history, or let's say a mythologized view of history.
Fully agree here. I actually like the distinction by Jacques Ellul on propaganda, where he sort of distinguishes between political propaganda, what we usually mean by speaking about propaganda is like political campaigns and like disinformation in a way. Again, like all these terms has to be explained. But then he says there is a different type of propaganda on a much deeper level and often is much more subtle, which is what is called sociological propaganda. And that's exactly change of language, mythology, broader long-term narratives, identities, perception of reality, and I believe also perception of space and time in a way, which I would love to explore as well. And what we are seeing at the frontier of this warfare is how these two combine and one reinforces the other. And perhaps, I believe there's too much attention to this superficial level of political propaganda. All the big programs of EU, around fighting disinformation, fact checking, that's all beautiful and great, I believe. But I think we are missing this sort of hidden layer. And OpenMinds, in a way, has a mission to and some sort of broader kind of vision to dive deeper into that, which is extremely hard domain. And it's like, you know, it's not studied well. It's hard to operationalize it. I mean, how do you measure that? How do you just even set the metrics, you know, and measurement system? But yeah, we believe that that's where the real threat is happening, which is much longer, and that's where the focus should be, at least. Yeah.
Well, we'll come on to the methodology and the techniques you use. And I think crucially as well, you can generate these insights, but then it's a question, you know this from your marketing experience, it's then how do you actually get people to pay attention to that? How do you turn what you've discovered, or your reports, your data, your charts, etc., how do you turn that into a story that can be consumed and that can then impact people's behavior? I think that's one of the most challenging things, because I've been looking at lots of aspects of the emerging disinformation ecosystem, and some of it feels so exciting and so interesting, and yet if I was to take a poll of, let's say, the audiences watching my channel and some of the other pro-Ukrainian channels, you know, I talk a lot more about disinformation on mine than perhaps some of the other ones do, I wouldn't mind betting that 99.9% of the audience would have never actually seen or communicated or been influenced by one of these sort of pieces of research, or, you know, stopfake.org and so on. There are some fantastic organizations out there, and I know some have actually had quite a big impact on Ukrainian people within Ukraine. Filter is another one created by Valery Kharpp, and that has a huge impact on, you know, individuals and society. But a lot of these ideas, a lot of these organizations do not, even though they're doing, you know, highly well-regarded work and incredible work. So what's the difference here? How do you do your research and then create an impact in the real world?
Wonderful question. I think it's worth going on a journey of the history of methods and technologies and tools around disinformation for a while to just understand where we are currently. I believe I would go maybe from early 2000s, because that's a period where there was quite significant technological advancement in the field of big data collection, of course, social media. Before that, of course, all of that were mostly all of the measurements of disinformation, I think, were quite conceptual on the level maybe of opinion polls and focus groups, qualitative studies, more sort of classical methods of research in social sciences. But from the early 2000s, with an advent of social media, we are seeing also the emergence of these companies and initiatives that study big data and discussions in social media. And usually the first wave, I think, of these efforts were focused a lot on detection of fakes, slightly later detection of coordinated inauthentic behavior, if their methodology allows that. And there are a huge range of problems around that, because social media companies claim they are dealing with that, but we don't have third-party validation mechanism to see how that actually works in practice and how effective they are. So moving all the way from like detection of fakes, detection of coordinated inauthentic behavior, to more advanced things like network analysis and narrative intelligence or narrative analysis. And there are many companies and great initiatives that are doing that. And that became also more affordable and available with an advent of just better computations of new wave of machine learning technologies. And I believe we are slightly sort of stepping into the new third wave of this whole range of tools and methods, which is about answering the question, not just what happens, and not just where it happens and how it evolves, but what impact does it have on final public attitudes, beliefs, and potentially behaviors. And I would put a very strong comma between each of that, because they're quite distinct things. And that's the hardest question, because there are many fakes and many sort of troll activities, and we cannot really, track all of that, and there is not even legal mechanism to fully sort of ban this activity, and there are no incentive maybe in many government bodies to do that as well. The question becomes, what out of the myriads of these narratives and inauthentic coordinated activities are actually harming the population? And by harming, what we mean polarizing it, creating additional hatred between communities, potentially also promoting conspiracy theories and all other things. And this is the domain where I believe technology would be not enough itself. And that's why we have to also start looking at maybe the edge of behavioral sciences and experimentating methods at tech as well, in a way. How can we launch real-life experiments, like exposing one group to a particular counter-narrative and not exposing the other group, running this sort of real-life A/B testing and seeing the impact of countermeasures as well. And this is something that is just starting to happen, I believe, but it might be a big game changer in the whole thing. Like, instead of focusing on just detection, we will maybe in the first time of the history be able to scientifically see the effects of counter-influence strategies. Again, very complicated field, but I would love to see more focus of attention on this sort of new frontier, rather than just debunking like disinformation and other techniques.
And that's something we've talked about on the channel quite a lot, which is that propaganda operates on a holistic, multi-layered kind of strategy. And actually, we saw this and we see it again in the context of the US election. A lot of disinformation, a lot of false narratives, a lot of stuff which is deliberately fed into the system, knowing that people's partisan attitudes are going to mean that they're not going to condemn their candidate, even when they talk nonsense. And this applies actually to both sides to an extent, although obviously the nonsense tends to be more prevalent on the MAGA Republican side. But you do get potential narratives floating around on both, criticizing and supporting and so on. And I get the impression that from the first Trump victory, part of the propaganda effect is not necessarily to even convince you of something, but it's to provoke from the system itself a kind of, call it like the body's immune reaction. But not just immune reaction, it's designed to send your body into overdrive. And I think they did this very effectively, meaning that you end up attacking Trump, you end up attacking more vociferously and more violently and aggressively, and that actually, rather than bringing people over to your side, that actually alienates people. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which they're not just trying to convince you of something or convince you of nothing, but actually triggers a response that may even undermine your efforts to tackle propaganda.
It's a beautiful observation, and I wouldn't comment much US politics arena because it's not really the area of my focus, but taking what you've just said and let's apply it to the context of Russia and Ukraine. Of course, the goal of Russian propaganda is not internally, let's say, within Russia, to the best extent we can see that, is not to persuade people in a particular line of narrative, just one or two sort of explanations of reality. I believe the goal is deeper in a way that let's create hundreds and thousands of different narratives that potentially would put a person in a position of frustration and eventually death of political agency, but also just death of agency itself. And we see that there is quite a lot of empirical evidence on that, actually. There are quite a few studies asking the question, to what extent do you believe your actions and deeds and participation in the world shapes your future? And in Russia, the answers to that were quite, pessimistic, in a way that people are just not have that much belief in the free will overall, and really blame external forces in the majority of things happening, but also rely on external forces in the face of centralized government and decision-making hierarchy, and expect them to resolve majority of issues as well, and that's the machinery. Then the question, if we want to alter that in a way, how do we create conditions that the rebirth of agency can happen? Which is hard philosophical question, but also technical question, and how do you approach that? Which I would leave here for the audience to just think on, and reflect and
It's a fascinating one, isn't it? Because the way I tend to do it is to look for narratives. So to not assume that someone is an agent or an asset of Russia, or that they're necessarily down a rabbit hole, but to look at the number of narratives, synthetic narratives, that they don't actually question at a deep level, but will repeat, and which goes into their overall response to questions like Ukraine, Russia, etc. And then to look at the frequency of that repetition and whether they have changed any of those narratives themselves, or whether they're regurgitating it. Is that a useful way of perhaps of looking at it, which is this sort of narrative pattern response?
It's very similar to what's happening in the domain of marketing as well, isn't it? Like you just repeat the same, expose people to the same marketing message, and expect slightly better conversion eventually. The question is, what is conversion in case of propaganda? Is conversion actually lack of conversion? Lack of participation in any sort of activity? If you look at the society with, let's say, two axes, you have horizontal axis of communication with your peers and communities, and you have vertical axis, like your relation to the government and just power hierarchy. What Russian propaganda does in particular, it looks like it kills just vertical axis, but it also kills the horizontal one. It makes society atomized. It's even works on the level that people do not spend that much time in what's called third spaces. You have work and home as your first and second space, and you have usually you have third space, like where people convene and have discussions, and participate in some sort of communal activities, and there is quite a lot of evidence this as a concept is shrinking in authoritarian countries like Russia as well, which means propaganda influences behavior, which creates the whole sort of feedback cycle that influence then the perception again, and then you have this downward spiral of people just becoming locked in themselves, and community and this notion of like just being belong to someone, to have this additional identity other than just, let's say, Russian imperial identity, or is something that I think is happening there. There's also death of identity in a way.
And it's interesting now, there's 2 points I'll bring up there. One is, and I observed this from I think, sort of seeing the post-Soviet environment and seeing how that kind of worked. One way to do it is of course to ban things, but that's quite expensive and crude, and it risks a reaction. I think a far more effective way that the Soviet Union managed, and then Russia clearly has managed to do to an extent as well, is to allow spaces, but to make sure they are penetrated by your spies and agents and messages, or they are controlled in some way, not fully, but partially. That makes those spaces inauthentic. So yes, you can participate in them, but you're not participating in something that creates real community or agency or can give rise to ideas that are threatening to any of that structure, because very quickly, if those groups, start to evolve in that direction, they get shut down very quickly. So how important is it in a tyrannical regime to be able to turn both physical spaces and informational spaces into environments that feel neither secure nor authentic? Is poison in the well almost, to make things sort of inauthentic and suspect, and to dumb them down in some ways as well.
So this well poisoning as a metaphor, let's use it, which is beautiful. You're never sure which well is poisoned, so you would better just avoid drinking it at all, right? So you never know the Telegram chat you entered, and potentially you want to complain about your local governor on not doing particular policy or dealing well with the problems you have in your local community. You'll stop doing that at some point, because there is a feeling that you're being watched, and then even, I believe in Russia there are still, of course, some percentage of population, we can of course debate how many, but let's say not less than 10% of people that do not really support the war, and even sometimes can say that somewhere out loud in opinion poll. But the question that they are also the victims of this spiral of silence, which more and more doesn't allow them to project these attitudes, and others are afraid that they are just alone with these thoughts, and everyone else. So there is like big social norm that's forming that, okay, this is what the central government is saying is the only thing that probably we should rely on, and there are no really alternative opinions. Or on the other hand, there are so many alternative things and explanation that it doesn't just make sense for me to starting figuring that out.
It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of investment of effort to try and figure things out, and actually, who's got the time for that?
And the key emotion here is not just, I think it's in kind of relation to that, is care, in a way. Do I care about the truth, or do I care about the importance, significance of that information? And it looks like people just first initially lose this relation of care, and then it doesn't matter for them whether it's truthful or it's not truthful. I mean, many people actually would agree that central government and media distort reality. They wouldn't object that, I believe. And but they are still buying into this whole new set of rules, and just, for them it doesn't really matter much. Well, they might distort reality, they might say this, and some of them are conscious that's a tool of governing as well. But that's relation of, I think, caring about the truth that makes a difference, which boils down eventually again to the agency, to the feeling of agency.
And that's a classic Soviet whataboutism that can be used there. Yes, things are not great, and you don't live in a free society, and yes, we lie to you all the time, but nowhere is free, and there's no such thing as truth, and everybody lies. So that's a very powerful idea.
And just recent events with Pavel Durov arrest is like a very good example, and we are just basically tracking how the whole media landscape in Russia reacts to that. This has become just a very strong exemplary narrative of, oh, look, actually, the Western countries are just full of hypocrisy, of telling us, oh, we are, just not following the human rights law and other things, but look what's happening there. Like, they're just taking genius Russian entrepreneur and locking him, arresting him. exactly what you said. I believe it also relates to this perception of time. My hypothesis, which we are trying now to also somehow empirically measure, but we clearly see that from focus groups and interviews with people, that in Russia there is no future as a time category. And I'll explain what I mean here. The only future that is created in Russia is actually reflection into the past. To answer what are we hoping for with all these invasion into Ukraine, special military operation, repressions, the answer is look at our past. We are trying to, just connect with this past and be calm, but also just have this rebirth of big Russian empire in a way. And we have all the means, but also right to do that. So we are morally kind of superior in this sense. And which turns the whole perception into the past as well. So I believe feelings like hope, faith in a broader sense is something that propaganda kills as well, with this death of the future in a sense. And that creates a very different breed of human beings.
And that's interesting, because I've been trying to figure out the key differences between Ukraine and Russia. And that might sound like a sort of simplistic question, but Ukraine was under the Soviet system for all that period. It only had an independent governance for about sort of 2 or 3 years, 1918 to 21, before that was brutally suppressed by the Bolsheviks. Then even then, the Ukrainian Bolsheviks, the Ukrainian communists, were ruthlessly purged. So you've had decades of extremely brutal attempt to Russify Ukraine. You've had centuries of repression of the sort of nascent Ukrainian identity, language, and so on. Repeated attempts to eradicate Ukrainian language, Ukrainian, the nuances of Ukrainian worship, religion, etc. And then, of course, you've got literature and art, which is a whole other thing, the executed Renaissance, and so on. With all of this, that's the stuff that people talk about. What they don't talk about is the Soviet process that you've talked about to destroy the horizontal, any sense of community, any sense of agency, any hope that you might be able to organize with other people who might share somehow a worldview or interests with. The only group in society, I feel, who was allowed to create any sense of class or commonality was the KGB and the military. And both those cultures, of course, are built on very much an imperial commonality. There is imperialism and statism. It's not such a mystery for me how none of these things function in Russia. It's a mystery for me how these things actually survived in Ukraine and functioned in Ukraine to the point where in 2014 it was able to resist Russian invasion and aggression, despite the fact that Yanukovych had hollowed out the military and tried to destroy the state essentially from the inside out, as I believe very much was the guidance and instruction for Moscow that you should do. It's a miracle to me, at least, that this idea of the horizontal society has survived in Ukraine. And then you see media literacy projects, you see your project and many others that are seeking to create resilience against that aggression which is ongoing. Do you have any kind of explanation for how it survived and how it is transforming into the kind of project that you've got?
It's a beautiful question. That would require hard thinking, but I'll try to make an attempt to answer that. Professor Yaroslav Hnizdovskyi from Ukrainian Catholic University always says events like that would require some time for us to actually properly reflect on them. So I think we are just too close on the timeline of history to have really proper sort of understanding and have good lenses to see at these events. They're just, like 90s and 2000s. I think they're just too close. And what's happening now is so much revealing about the dynamics. But look at the whole history of Ukrainian movement for the independence in the 20th century was small group of like Ukrainian insurgent army and others, Holodny Yar in central Ukraine. Small groups that survived, that actually were very successful in maintaining this tradition of passing a particular sort of vision and final goal through decades. I don't think you see anything similar in the history of Russia, because they were the nation that ruled all the others. So they were always on top of kind of political decisions, and they were the ones who basically created Soviet Union. Well, and Ukrainians were led to this arena very late in the times of Khrushchev, and maybe slightly earlier. But when it comes to the events of Revolution of Dignity, and I believe this full-scale invasion of Russia, what helped Ukraine a lot is strong network between private sector and civil society. You had Bolotna in Russia in 2011. I think it wasn't quite strong enough. Maybe it was just a little bit too early to change something there. All the tradition of relation between private sector and government in Russia from the very beginning, like from the events of Khodorkovsky arrest and others, was just a signature of them slowly giving up control and like bending, under the pressure of government sort of control. And you see a similar pattern in Ukraine, but you still see this sort of echo of these small networks that somehow managed to survive, managed to not really get oppressed in the times of Yanukovych, to survive through these times. And then in the events of 2014 and later, that became the base of the resilience in a way. And that's my humble opinion on this topic. But being an entrepreneur in Ukraine and being sort of inside the community and exposed to just the thinking and all these dynamics of civil society and private sector actually influencing the outcome of the war greatly. It would be hard to imagine for someone in the United States or UK that civil society actually were responsible for majority of short-term, like last mile humanitarian help, military help. In like it was so crucial to withstand this first month of attacks, and that central government wasn't really successful with organizing the whole the chain of logistics and other things. So I believe that that's something that helped us survive, and that's something that we have as quite distinct and unique feature compared to other states that were behind the Iron Curtain at least.
And that's an interesting response, because when things break, and this happens in this country as well, because we're well used to deferring to government, electing governments, and deferring our agency onto them, and a lot of people have a sense of responsibility, but a lot sort of won't necessarily. It's not that they're not politically active, but they'll defer to the elected representatives. In Ukraine, there doesn't seem to be that same deferment. It's like, if the elected representatives go against the majority, then they're done. But if there's a problem and it's broken, people don't stand around complaining about it. They're immediately thinking about, well, how can we possibly fix this? They're not waiting for somebody to turn up and fix it. That seems to me quite the opposite in Russia, where, as you say, agency has been dissolved. You wouldn't tend to get anybody banding together and fixing a problem, even if that problem was their own front yard, the strip of road right outside their house, their stairwell, their responsibility, or their sense of agency and responsibility, I think ends at their front door. And beyond that, that's all somebody else's problem. That kind of leads me to you and your efforts about what drives you personally to create OpenMinds and what that journey's been like. You know, it'd be interesting to learn a bit about the work that you actually do and the sort of relationships that you've built to help build OpenMind, but also relate that to what drives you to resolve this problem and to say, you know, to assume that no one's going to come along and do it. So you jump up as an entrepreneur and do that. And that's very Ukrainian in a way.
Thanks for highlighting these features of Ukrainian. Yeah, I believe you catch this quite well. What drives me personally is the attempt and ambition to help democratic world create means and tools and technologies to withstand in informational warfare against authoritarian countries. And looking at our history, I think we are now 20-30 years behind in the advancements of methods of influence and counter-influence, and we were quite shy and maybe reluctant to make any advancements in that since the end of the Cold War for the last 35 years. And the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, but also all the preceding like election, you know, interference and other things, creation of troll farms. These were the precursors of like small signs, but sometimes even big signs that we don't know how to deal with that. We don't have anything to actually present as a sort of counter strategy, and we don't even have appetite. We feel frustrated and feared because you know, from World War II till 1991, we were like, let's say, I'll specify actually, United States in particular as a sort of leading power, were doing many things as if no one was watching. But I think in the last 10-20 years, they are reluctant to do activities in the domain of informational warfare because they think everybody is watching. So it flips around, and then they have resources, but they lost this art of basically the art of informational war in a way. And I believe Ukraine is now in the position to suggest to the Western world and democracies the new framework, the new strategy, the new angle of just implication of force in that domain. And we have so much exposure to these real world kind of things happening in that domain. Like there are hundreds of influence campaigns happening every month, and just, you know, learning in creating these feedback loops and understanding, trying different methods, trying different technologies. That what puts us in the position to then make some inferences out of it and suggest it as a sort of solution to the other countries as well.
It's interesting you mentioned there the US, because it seems to me that the US has been trying to force Ukraine to fight a very conventional war, a very attritional war, one that doesn't use the power of secrecy and surprise. In fact, the US has been trying to do the exact opposite, signal to Russia exactly what's coming next and what Ukraine is capable of, so that none of it triggers Russia or comes as a surprise to them. So as you say, there's this extreme aversion to being secretive, to doing things that might actually have a sudden and surprising impact. We can only imagine what the Kursk counteroffensive is doing behind closed doors. I think they are having kittens, certainly people like Jake Sullivan and so on. But in Ukraine, there seems to be an understanding that warfare is not one-dimensional, it's multidimensional. So yes, the Kursk incursion has a military strategic aspect, but it has an informational aspect at the same time. And that's not bolted on. They are one and the same thing. So when you're planning an action, you think about the surprise, you think about the scale, you think about the psychological impact, as well as the military aspect. And it's all part of the same hybrid approach. And we see with Kursk, we see with sinking the Crimea Black Sea Fleet, we see in the targeting of Russian airfields in Crimea, it's very effective on this multifaceted warfare angle.
Exactly, and we of course all understand there are no events in the vacuum. So every military operation or counter operation is already an influence mechanism. And let's take as an example Kursk incursion. First, it's a statement inside Ukraine to Ukrainian audience. They haven't seen that much victories, probably since, I would say, Kherson and Kharkiv counteroffensive, and there were quite a lot of huge expectations actually in 2023 to like this summer counteroffensive that sort of technically didn't go as probably was planned. And I think what's happening now is just a good shift of momentum. But yeah, it just, I think, created additional hope in the society as well, that we are still capable of doing things like that. So that's first influence sort of path, let's say. The second one is, of course, all our allies and decision makers, but also just general population of the democratic class, but also other countries. What it shows, we should really question the red lines as a concept. If we can occupy 1,000 square kilometers of the land of Russia, it shows there are no red lines to the Western audience. Or like we should just start questioning the whole notion of red lines. It also shows that Ukrainian armed forces are capable of doing operations like that, and they should increase an appetite of Western decision makers to allow for more operations like that, and they are being quite good asymmetric things that actually make the difference. But also importantly, that sends a message inside Russia, and that's what I'm personally the most interested in. We see a huge increase of anxiety levels reported by some polling agencies, but also from big data social media analysis. And the anxiety is linked not just to Kursk operation, but also to many adjacent factors like potential mobilization, inability of government to protect themselves. Even the notion of war, it was really never present in the discourse much. They were talking about that as special military operation, but actually majority of people, excluding probably February and March and some crucial events, are not following the war that much. And we know the numbers between 20 and 30% are actually actively searching for information about the war, being subscribed to like news channels that cover that. But a lot of people feel quite indifferent, and we just describe why that happens. So events like that bring attention back to this whole thing. But it also starts questioning what it was for, all of this effort. And I think one of the most interesting findings about Kursk is people who themselves suffered from like harm to their real estate, or like just had like saw the explosions, you know. Before Kursk, they started blaming NATO and Ukrainian government even more, and there was more hatred towards it, the collective sort of forces of the West and Ukraine. But now we are seeing actually the very opposite effect. They are becoming less supportive of the war, less supportive of mobilization, and that we could clearly see from big data analysis of social media discourse. And they are willing to talk more about that with their friends and peers as well. which never happened before, or at least we didn't have good measurements to track that. But yeah, I believe there are very good things happening with events like that. And you mentioned this sort of leverage that information landscape gives to the physical kinetic events. Exactly, like you can have an event if it's not covered properly, if you don't shape the narrative around that, the effects can be manifold less, and the investment in terms of human resources is very incomparable. Like to conduct an informational coverage campaign is way less expensive than conduct the kinetic operation, of course.
And of course, the US would say that they're not in the business of regime change, etc. And their actions seem to show that that's the case. They have not made any attempt to topple Putin's regime. They haven't even made any attempts to topple the potato Führer Lukashenko. Ukraine, however, this is a much more existential struggle. Ukraine understands the Russian mindset and Russian society, I think, far better than anyone in Washington and Berlin. That is quite clear now. That includes the myriad of so-called experts who are informing the national security team in the US. And I've read some of their output, and it's clear to me they don't really, purposefully or accidentally, they don't understand the Russian mindset and motivations at all. But Ukraine does. So I'm not sure Ukraine is trying to prompt an uprising against Putin. They know that's not going to happen. But if life becomes a little less convenient, if security becomes a little less certain, and if people are forced to stop pretending there is no war, that might be enough to sort of trigger some interesting things in Russia, some instability that will either force Putin to give up his ambitions or something more substantial. So how important is the kind of information and research that you're doing on changes in Russian perceptions? How important is that to help inform Ukraine's military strategy, for instance, as well as the pressure it's putting on its foreign partners and allies?
I can answer that question only to the extent I can, of course, but first and foremost, it's search for vulnerability. I would say something that a lot of my Ukrainian friends would hate, but I don't think the regime change in Russia should be our goal. I think the problem is much deeper, and that's partially what we again referred to at the very beginning of the conversation, talking about sociological propaganda as a notion. It's this imperial identity, but also big appetite within the Russian minds and moral superiority to actually dictate what Ukraine is and isn't and where it should belong to. That's the problem. And it's not we don't have to stand in the position where we hope if Putin dies, something happens, someone comes to rule this new country, there'll be some turmoil, and we'll figure that out somehow and, return back to normal. I think when this idea of imperialism, but also a big resentment now towards the West and Ukraine in a way, which is present, interestingly so much more towards West than Ukraine. If there was a recent poll by Levada back in July, where they asked to what extent you believe Ukraine is guilty of the special military operation and responsible for that. The answer was, I believe, 11% when they were asked if the US and Western countries were responsible for that. The answer is 64%, if I'm not mistaken. And it's growing since 2022, actually. It is different. So people are starting blaming more West than Ukraine, which is interesting, actually. So, answering your question, yeah, this type of research informs what are the vulnerabilities that we could deal with immediately, more mid-term and long-term as well. And sometimes the whole strategy of information warfare informs what is the bigger priority now. And it's naturally happening that short-term things become higher priorities, of course. So it's partially also within our interest to keep the lenses on this broader term, like longer term change that we aiming to achieve in the minds of people as well. Yeah.
And it's a year since Prigozhin's mutiny, and there was incredibly interesting reaction to that, especially in Rostov, where he was briefly. There seemed to be a very easy and swift transfer of allegiance from people, from Putin to the new strongman, or the stronger man as he was perceived. Is there much sociological evidence of that change, or was that event far too short-lived to be able to, really pick up that sort of psychological response to it?
I think there is some just limitation of methods we have to answer that question properly. We were very lucky to conduct an opinion poll just one day before the mutiny. And it was just pure coincidence. We planned that a few weeks before and launched the poll, collected data, started some analysis. Next day we wake up and the whole thing is happening. And then we measured the same set of questions basically that was asked once again a few days after the mutiny happened, the attempt of mutiny. And honestly, we were quite confused with the answers, because initially, one day before the mutiny, people perceived Prigozhin as one of the very few, if not the only person who can speak truth and actually criticize government. And he was in a sort of moral position to do that, because he was always on the front line, shooting videos, like talking to the soldiers, actually it was felt like he's very integral part of that special military operation frontline life, as opposed to people in Kremlin. But right after the mutiny, the very same people we believe that were answering this question and depicting Prigozhin in very sort of positive fashion immediately started saying that, oh, maybe he was just rather the blah blah boy, that was very kind of aggressive and didn't know properly what he's doing, what doesn't have good long-term calculations and other things. So I believe there was some sort of psychological justification mechanism. You have to explain why he failed to do the mutiny, and your picture of reality should remain sort of coherent. And that was probably the only way to do that in a way. Though when we are talking about coherence of reality in Russian minds, that's also questionable. Yeah, we see quite contradictory responses to many questions, like, do you support the war? 60+% of people say yes, but if we ask, would you support if Putin decides to stop the special military operation, then you see slightly smaller numbers, but also saying yes, we would probably support that. So it doesn't, like, they're just probably to the big extent following the authoritarian lead in this sense.
I think of that almost as agency being a little bit like sort of classical physics. When you ask someone a question and they have some responsibility for the answer, this superposition of possibilities has to collapse down into a single point of view. Whereas Russians have no agency, they have no responsibility. They can they can exist in a constant quantum state of multiple points of view that don't necessarily agree with each other in any way, and there's no pressure to collapse it down into that singularity of responsibility. And that comes down to your very difficult question, which of course we're not going to get answered here, which is how do you create that sense of agency and responsibility in a society where it's been eroded to such a degree? Ukraine perhaps shows how it can be done, but there are already deep centuries-old foundations that also help to explain why it happened and re-emerged. What are you planning for your project? What big ambitions do you have for your project and research, as well as its impact on the real world?
Beautiful question. I would divide the answer into 3 parts. There are certain things we planning to achieve, not just with OpenMinds as a project. I would say as an ecosystem of Ukrainian informational resilience. I think it would be worth also mentioning some other efforts that are happening. The beautiful kind of, how to say that, coordination of government, private sector, civil society, and all of that. So the first one is just, can we form better strategy and try out different theories of change, and better understand what kind of final aims do we have in terms of informational warfare with Russia. It's not just about what kind of final output we expect from Russian people to happen, and we don't really, I would say I'm quite skeptical about any sort of regime change, or this is too early to talk about. But it's also how do we create mechanisms and tools that would help us see which outputs are more likely than others, and because some goals might be just unobtainable. I mentioned the sort of this long-term aspiration to change this imperial identity somehow. That's the root of the problem, and this is not the first aggression of Russia towards Ukraine, as we all know from the long history of their relationship. But again, is this problem within the scope of what we can deal with now? It can be a sort of aspiration, North Star. Yeah, we can always keep in mind and have as a very ambitious goal, but can we create good proxy goals before that? That would help us move in that direction slowly. The second layer here is just, I would say, creation of the new Axis and Defense Alliance, and particularly in the domain of hybrid warfare, including cyber resilience, cognitive informational resilience as well, both in the aspects of defense, but also counter-offense in a way. Yeah, can we let them know that we are capable of punching back? Because currently they don't look like being really afraid of that. Yeah, but by them I mean authoritarian countries, or not just Russia in particular, because they are forming quite a strong axis now, and we see NATO and sort of all the existing defense mechanisms are not really, frankly speaking, effective in that sense.
They don't exude strength, do they?
Yes.
They don't give the appearance of something you'd be a little bit wary.
Yeah, and then there is a need for this new defense mechanism, and the new axis, I think, emerges Kyiv, Warsaw, Tallinn, Stockholm, London, Washington DC, maybe to some extent, and that's where we want that axis to grow when it comes in particular to cyber and informational warfare. And I'm not saying these are the countries that are not in the active kinetic conflict are thinking of offensive mechanisms, but they are just becoming a very good partners to Ukraine and sharing their experiences and technology and all the way around. So I think this creation of the new axis is hugely important, and there's already Tallinn mechanisms in cyber security domain that's being executed, and I believe there's something similar that should happen, and we would be very happy to contribute to in the domain of cognitive and information warfare as well.
And really sort of conclude, my assumption here is that even when Russia is defeated, even when Ukraine regains its sovereign territories, even when Ukraine becomes an extraordinary fortress, military fortress against further Russian incursion, the informational cognitive warfare, that's not going to suddenly end. If anything, we might see an increase of that as Russia's military response fails.
Definitely, and I think our task is here partially to help other allies to realize they're already in the very active stage of the Cold War in these domains of cyber and informational warfare. They are thinking it's just Ukraine that's fighting kinetic war, but also, okay, these other types of hybrid warfare. But no, actually, look at all of the attacks. Countries like Estonia, of course, know about that a lot, but also other Baltic states. Poland suffered from all kinds of cyber attacks of Russia. And I think this should become, honestly, big point of focus that we are already in the middle of the warfare. It's just different type of warfare. And we should recreate the whole institutional mechanisms, how we distribute resources for that, how we fund new programs, how do we train people even and specialists to be able to deal with something like that. And this response is quite lagging. And one of the missions I see is for us to show that small organization from small countries like Ukraine with limited resources can still be effective in this asymmetric warfare with the proper application of new technologies, of new methods, and a lot of trials and errors and learning iteratively.
And of course, the propaganda that we see, the propaganda we're aware of, we could easily convince ourselves that, okay, we're not silly, we can see it coming, we've understood it, it's over there, we can point to it. But that is a form of arrogance which will enable us to miss the propaganda influence, the coercion that we haven't seen coming. And I think a lot of the programs, a lot of the disinformation programs that existed to date have been looking at the stuff that can be kind of spotted in plain sight almost, whereas it's the influence on policymakers, it's the influence on strategists, advisors, even I would say sort of analysts and writers. There's a huge investment in coercion and influence in that sphere, which is almost part of a sort of privileged or protected domain that doesn't get the same attention. But actually, while we're being distracted by visible propaganda, this stuff can have far more deeper and far-reaching implications for things like military and foreign policy. Well, this is something for future conversation. Maybe just a few words on that. And then we can use that maybe as a teaser for the next conversation.
I love it. And I think this hidden layer of influence, let's assume we never actually, in the foreseeable future, will be able to capture that, operationalize that, and measure that, and work with that. The question becomes, how do we design the whole resilience system, defense system, that would be in a way resilient, I would say, but also potentially anti-fragile, talking in the term of Nassim Taleb, to these attempts. And then as democracy, we have this huge limitation that the horizon of planning is within the next political election term, like 4 or 5 years. And to think properly about these kind of problems, you need much bigger horizon. That's why authoritarian governments are quite often much more advanced in this domain, because it requires slightly longer term of thinking as well, slightly longer perspective. So potential answer would be, can we create institutions that would independently work on these problems? And it's not just about research, but also about tools and communication mechanisms as well, that could start investing a lot of effort and thinking about that, and that will be they will be quite assured they will not be disorganized, like funding 3, 4, 5 years into their lifespan. So that's one of the potential solutions to that problem. Yeah. Second solution is, again, I think the whole media literacy and critical thinking is good, of course, but it's very hard to measure whether it has real effect. And it's on the level of education for sure, but it's also just human psychology and biases naturally assert that this is quite unachievable goal with the confirmation bias. And look at the design of all the current social media and how people consume news. It's a feed, you scroll, that serves you content you are more likely to endorse and like, which is just epitome of confirmation bias itself. And we don't have any alternative to that. And unless this is changed, and that's how majority of news and information is now consumed, which is linked to these very intrinsic psychological mechanisms, we will keep facing all these sorts of problems, I believe. And I'm quite skeptical if all the media literacy and critical thinking programs can really compete with this our internal feature of our minds and brains.
Well, there's plenty to pick up on there for a future discussion. For now, it's been a massive pleasure having you on the Silicon Curtain podcast, and it's wonderful to be able to do one of these in real life as opposed to just sort of staring at screens on Zoom. Hopefully the audience will find that compelling as well. Thanks so much for your work. Thank you so much for arranging this fantastic conversation.
Pleasure is all mine.